Hello. My favorite religious denomination is the Episcopal Church. I wasn't confirmed Episcopalian. I wasn't born Episcopalian. How I got there was through a long, complicated journey, and it took a long time to ever find what I consider to be my theological home in the Episcopal Church. My first exposure to any kind of religious organization or church as a very young person prior to getting into first grade was to a Pentecostal denomination called the Congregational Holiness Church. And even as a young child, I was really scared of that Pentecostal church. That didn't work for me. I didn't like that too much. It was a lot of, to my mind, yelling and screaming and all that sort of thing, and it just never appealed to me. It was also this extremely exuberant, extroverted type of worship where you had people who were apparently, it looked like to me anyway, they were attempting to outdo one another. Everybody show each other how religious they were by running around the room and doing all kind of things. It never made any sense to me. I didn't like Pentecostalism then. I don't like it now. It's not something that makes any sense to me at all. And I can discuss issues related to Pentecostalism all day if somebody wants to discuss that with me. But the exposure to the Congregational Holiness Church didn't last too long. There were relatives on one side in particular who were predominantly Pentecostal, and so I was exposed to that kind of thinking for a very long time. But then my family made a move which, if you want to find out something really bizarre about my background, spoiler alert, here it comes. Because the family joined an organization called the Worldwide, that's one word, the Worldwide Church of God. And that's not like any Church of God you're probably familiar with. This is a Sabbatarian organization, meaning they observe a Saturday Sabbath. And it was a lot like, in a sense, remanufactured Judaism, because there was a very strong interest, a very strong emphasis, that is, that if you want to be on God's good side and have things work out for you when you die, that you had to be very strict about keeping all the Old Testament rules and regulations and observing all the Old Testament festivals. And this church did, apart from live animal sacrifices. They never did live animal sacrifices or stonings or anything like that. Wonder why that never happened. But they kept all these Old Testament days, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, all these things that you read about ancient Israel doing in Leviticus 23, and the emphasis in that church was on law keeping, and the services were very organized. They were not formal, but they were highly organized. Back in those days, what people usually wore to church on actually Saturdays and other days associated with the Jewish days was actually suits and ties for men, and dresses for, long dresses and things like that for the women. So the dress was, in a sense, kind of formal, and the services were highly organized, but they were not formal as I would later come to know formal. They were not liturgical as such. The emphasis during a Worldwide Church of God service was on extremely long sermons that could go an hour and a half or more. And you spent your entire career with that church trying to keep the law of Moses and keep it perfectly so that you could, as I said, and it takes a lot of explanation as to what they believed the reward of the saved was, but to put it in ways that most people could understand, to be on God's good side, you had to keep the law, and you had to do it very well. So it was like remanufactured Judaism with the name of Jesus Christ thrown in, and it was a very strict, tough environment. No marriages outside the church. They followed the Jewish dietary law. A lot of weird stuff, in my opinion, as I see it today. And if you want to know something about this Worldwide Church of God, well, what's left of that organization today is something known as Grace Communion International. And it has a lot of offshoots, because back in the mid-1990s or so, that church began to re-examine its whole belief system and the supreme authorities of that church changed the belief system to make it very much an evangelical type of church. So it continued under that name and eventually changed to Grace Communion International, but a bunch of organizations that wanted to keep the old teaching, the old ways, they started, and they left, and now they exist as organizations like the Church of God International or the Living Church of God and some of those things. But eventually moved out of the worldwide Church of God. Well, actually, as the doctrines and beliefs changed, the local church that I attended decided that they didn't need the national organization anymore. So they basically said, to hell with this, let's go do our own thing. And they became a non-denominational evangelical church. And as soon as they did, there was all this contention because the worldwide church was about as far away from Pentecostalism as you could possibly get. The services were strictly organized. They didn't have a book of common prayer or anything like that, but everything was very organized from start to finish, and the laity didn't have much of a role in the services, singing and praying and that kind of thing, but the laity didn't have much of a role. And as soon as this local church went independent and became a non-denominational Christian church, then you had a lot of conflict about worship. Some wanted it to be, really organized and kind of liturgical, kind of like Presbyterians, like I sort of favored, and other people wanted to move into this happy-clappy, exuberant thing where you've got people, swaying to the music and throwing their hands up in the air and running around the room and all that kind of stuff, which has always struck me as extremely shallow and just a way to sort of put on a show so people can decide who is more religious than the next guy. You put your religion on display. You show other people that you're more spiritual, and a lot of people won't like me saying that, but that's what goes on in a lot of these happy clappy type churches. Well, I moved on from that and never had been baptized before. So as an adult, I was baptized into the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA. And compared to what I'd been through before, that was a very good fit, or it seemed to be at the time. I was a Republican at that time. Still hadn't changed my political beliefs. Was still sort of buying into some of that philosophy, and that was about to change. But that, of course, brought me into conflict with this Presbyterian Church in America, or a lot of its members, because it's not overtly stated, but it's more or less implied in the Presbyterian Church of America, PCA, that you've got to be a right-wing conservative Republican if you want to be a Christian. And I love the liturgical worship and all that. Everything was so highly organized from start to finish, and the choirs were beautiful, and the sermons were long, but they made a lot of sense to me. And there were things about Calvinism that I didn't like, but I sort of accepted that as the price of being in this majestic, huge church that I belonged to, and I later moved on to a smaller one. But there came a time when the dominant political paradigm in that church no longer worked for me. It was after the 2008 election, and that was the year that I decided to vote Democratic, because I realized, I'm progressive, I'm not conservative, so I voted Democratic and supported Barack Obama. And I started to hear all this nonsense from different people who hated the Democratic Party and hated Obama and all that kind of thing. And I should have known all that before. Don't know why I didn't pick up on it before. But it got to a point that I could no longer accept the PCA because they were so predominantly conservative Republican, and they were so vocal about it. And when I look in the good book, the Bible, I do not see conservative Republicanism. I'm sorry, I don't see that. So there was a question for a long time where I was going to go, what I was going to do, and I knew that the Episcopal Church was more inclusive and more diverse. And so in 2013 I attended my first Episcopal service, and I don't think I've ever felt more at home in a church than I do in the Episcopal Church. Love that church. Hopefully that'll be the place that I stay. And here's some reasons why. There's diversity of opinion about politics and theology. Everybody's not a conservative Republican in the Episcopal Church. There are differences of opinion about theology. Everything is not a matter of you must believe this way about everything or you're going to hell. There is certain diversity of opinion, including people who believe in science and don't believe in young earth creationism and are politically progressive. And important attributes such as that. The Episcopal Church basically leaves me alone. I'm able to come and go without being harassed. Now, it's true that I haven't been confirmed in the Episcopal Church, but I love the fact that as much as I want to, I can come and go anonymously and not have to be harassed by a bunch of people that are wanting to rope me into this, that, and the other, which goes on in a lot of churches. I've gone the involvement route before, the heavily involved route in regard to church, and what I've found is that it just brings unnecessary problems into my life. Life is complicated enough as it is. Don't need problems associated with the church I attend to, so I choose not to be as involved. Worship is organized and majestic. I've never liked the happy clappy worship style, probably won't ever like it. I think it's superficial and meaningless. I think it's a big show, people trying to put on a show and see who can present themselves as more spiritual, more religious. Don't like that at all. In the Episcopal Church, everything is organized and majestic and reverent, just like the Church of England. The services follow certain patterns, so you know what to expect every week. The standards are laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. You're going to celebrate Holy Eucharist, and you're going to have Rite 1 or Rite 2, or you're going to have a service of morning prayer. All that is laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. Very organized. You know what to expect. There are no strange surprises in Episcopal services. I love that. They do processions all the time. Every service in the Episcopal Church starts with a very majestic procession with the cross being carried up to the front and then the cross being carried out afterward, and the priest sort of leads the procession behind the cross. It's very majestic. The liturgy speaks to me in a spiritual way. These services that are laid out in the Book of Common Prayer, that works for me. It's not like this happy clappy nonsense. What I see in these evangelical happy clappy churches doesn't work for me at all. If I ever was going to be a clergyman, and I don't see that happening at this time, I'd be an Episcopal priest, because that door is pretty much closed. But they get to do all kind of great things, cool things on Sunday. They dress in these pretty majestic types of garb depending on the seasons. They lead processions, they lead the rituals, they lead through the things that are outlined in the Book of Common Prayer, and preaching is only a small part of the service. It's only like 15-20 minutes at the most, and then they get to administer the Holy Eucharist. And that's another great thing about Episcopal services. Holy Eucharist, or communion, also known as Lord's Supper in some church, that's every week. And I love the way they administer it, because in these evangelical happy clappy type churches, they go through all this stuff where they distribute the bread, and then they have to do a bunch of scripture readings. And everybody takes this bread at one time, and then they distribute. In most of the churches, it's actually grape juice. Afterwards, they distribute that, and then they do a bunch of reading or something, and everybody has to take that at once. Well, in the Episcopal Church, people go to the front of the church, row by row, and kneel at the altar, and it's sort of like an assembly line in a way. And then you take the bread and wine in your own individual way, the way I do it. They come along, they distribute the bread, and then they come along with a cup, and you dip the bread in the cup and take it that way. And it's just very majestic, very reverent, very worshipful. So, what do I like about the Episcopal Church? There's diversity of opinion. They basically leave me alone. I can be fairly anonymous. The worship is majestic, like the Church of England. The music in the Episcopal Church is absolutely beautiful. The services are beautiful, like I think they ought to be in the case of worshiping God. You have candles that are lit every week. You have these very majestic processions. There are times of standing and kneeling and praying in unison, and everybody does this, and in the process, nobody's calling all this attention to themselves. Look at me, look at how spiritual I am. It's just something that everybody sort of participates in, and there's none of this happy clappy, what I would like to call nonsense. So after going through a number of organizations over the years and never being really satisfied, the one that I have ended up being satisfied with more than any other is the Episcopal Church. Liturgical worship, diversity of opinion, they leave me alone. And so those are just a few reasons that the Episcopal Church works for me. And hopefully from now on, I haven't been confirmed at this time. Maybe that'll come later on. Because it is a rather involved process. It involves going through some classes and then answering some questions from the bishop in front of the church and all that. But hopefully that's the direction that I'll go. And my opinion is I'd always like to be Episcopal or at least Anglican from now on, because from what I've seen, it eliminates all these issues that I've seen in all these other happy-clappy denominations, things that just rub me the wrong way and seem shallow and meaningless. And you have the mystique, the ritual, the reverence that should exist in the worship of God. And so those are just a few of the reasons that I personally love the Episcopal Church. And if you're looking for a place that's different, if what's typically there in the evangelical community doesn't meet your needs, you don't like the happy-clappy worship, you don't like the self-centered, over-exuberant, hands in the air, swaying to the music, all that nonsense, you don't like these overly long-winded sermons that don't really accomplish anything, end up really not meaning anything to most people, if you don't like altar calls and all that sort of, in my opinion, nonsense, and you don't want to hear prosperity gospel, and you don't want to hear people talking about the end of the age coming next month, then I strongly suggest you check out the Episcopal Church, because what you will find is different there than you'll find in the evangelical community. So it just might be worth your while. So that's why I love the Episcopal Church, in the short version anyway. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.